Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Towards a Debt-Free 2023. My name is Lauren Jones. I am the Legal and Policy Director at the National Center for Access to Justice, based at Fordham Law School. And as our name implies, we work towards greater access to justice around the country. And we define that as the ability of people to assert their rights, to be heard in court, and to obtain protection under the law. And that, we believe, access to justice and justice itself should not depend on somebody's race, ethnicity, immigration status, language ability, where they live, or how much money they have. But we have seen is that too often our justice system, our civil and criminal legal systems, are engines of injustice, and that the outcome too often depends on those factors and others. And perhaps nowhere is that more stark than in the context of fines and fees. These are charges from criminal courts. They can result from a brush with the law as minor as a traffic violation up until a felony. And there's a dearth of data that we have on how many people are impacted and the scope of the problem. But our best estimate is that about 10 million Americans owe upwards of $50 billion, with a B, billion dollars in criminal court fines, fees, and restitution. And that falls disproportionately on Black and Brown communities and on poor and working class communities. And in the context of fines and fees, how much money you have can quite literally be the determining factor of your punishment and whether you have an impact for years to come. So if somebody has a brush with the law and is charged with fines and fees that are in the hundreds or even thousands of dollars, for someone who is wealthy, that may be a slap on the wrist. It may be an inconvenience. But for somebody who can't afford to pay immediately, those fines and fees can mean that they have debt and ruined credit that follows them for years or even decades to come. It can mean that their driver's license is suspended and they can't get to work, to school, to doctor's appointments, to the grocery store. It can mean that their voting rights are suspended, or even that they're become incarcerated for failure to pay or failure to appear in those cases. And so in 2021, at the National Center for Access to Justice, we decided to add fines and fees to our Justice Index, and we created the Fines and Fees Justice Index. And so what that is we looked at fines and fees policies around the country. We consulted with a group of experts and determined what we thought were the most important policies to protect the rights of people who are charged with fines and fees. So we looked at things like, have the states abolished some of the most pernicious fines and fees? For example, do they charge children who have had a brush with the juvenile court system, children or their families with fines and fees? Do judges actually consider somebody's ability to pay when they're setting fines and fees? And do they have the ability to modify fines and fees if somebody can't afford to pay, period? In terms of the collateral consequences, can somebody expunge their record if they have outstanding fines and fees? So we, with the help of law firms, researched the policies and practices in all 50 states and Washington, D.C. And what we found, it will be no surprise to many people on this call, is that the state of fines and fees policies is pretty dismal. So on a score of 0 to 100, we tried to be easy graders. We tried to give lots of partial credit. And what we found in 2021 was that no state received a passing score. No state actually got up to 60 out of a possible 100 points. And it's a pretty sobering look at what happens on fines and fees across the country. So we scored the states, we ranked them, in the hope that this would, number one, elucidate what's going on and make some of these policies that are both hard to find in the law, are complicated to read, and are often hidden from view from people who don't either work in this field or haven't experienced this directly. So we tried to make that clear. We also tried to create some competition among the states and give them incentive for states at the bottom of our rankings to improve and states at the top to become national models. So while the findings are fairly depressing, what I will say is that there is a lot of room for hope. And that is because we just finished our update of the Fines and Fees Justice Index. And so 1 year out, we created 50 state reports that will hopefully help to elucidate these findings even more in the states and to create a roadmap there. But what we found in producing these is that 12 states in just 1 year alone have improved their scores by passing laws, by having new court rulings that protect the rights of people who owe fines and fees. And Delaware passed HB 244, which moved it from 47th in the country on the Fines and Fees Justice Index up to 23rd. New York has a bill that is pending that would make it the first state in the country to eliminate all criminal court fees. There is a new national campaign launched by the Fines and Fees Justice Center to eliminate court fees nationwide. And so we are seeing that a movement is really starting and is taking off, and we are seeing that things are improving. And so I am really thrilled that we have panelists here today who are leading that work in Delaware and New York and nationally, who can talk to us about that and help us to understand some of the lessons and the strategies that are emerging. For those of you on this call or who are watching this webinar later, who are starting campaigns or thinking about how to move fines and fees policies in your own state. So I want to get to the panelists, but before I do that, I just wanted to say that we have the Q&A function. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a box for Q&A. And so we will have time at the end for people to ask questions. So please type your questions in there. We hope that people will interact with each other. Also, we have a lot of practitioners, I think, on here. And so if you have answers or you have comments, please feel free to make this into a conversation. And if you feel comfortable, please identify who you are and where you're working so that we can really help to build the community of folks around the country who are working to eliminate unjust fines and fees. I will say also that this webinar is being recorded. You all should have gotten that notice at the beginning. So with that, I want to turn to our, giving you a little sense of who our panelists are. First is Maryam Dede. She is a lawyer with the Juvenile Law Center, and she is a co-leader of the campaign to end debtor's prison in Delaware. Before becoming a lawyer with the Juvenile Law Center, she was an assistant public defender for the state of Delaware. Next, we have Peggy Herrera, who is an organizer with the Center for Community Alternatives and a leader for the No Price on Justice campaign in New York State. She is also a counselor for justice involved youth. And last but certainly not least, we have Priya Sarathy Jones, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the Fines and Fees Justice Center. She oversees their advocacy and campaign work across the country on fines and fees reform. Before that, she spent almost a decade at the Department of Justice, where part of her portfolio was public defense. So please join me in welcoming our fabulous panelists. You will also see on your screen David Udell, who is our Executive Director at the National Center for Access to Justice. And I want to thank David. He's going to be monitoring the questions and will help us at the end to make sure that we get all of your questions answered, or at least as many as we can. So with that, Maryam, I want to start with you because, as I mentioned, Delaware was near the bottom of the Fines and Fees Justice Index in a state that is a state of play that is pretty poor overall. Delaware actually stood out as one of the states that had some of the worst policies for fines and fees. So can you tell us a little bit about what that looked like in 2021 before this new bill? What was happening in Delaware on fines and fees?
Yeah, so we did a lot of kind of the basic bad things to do with fines and fees, I'll say. We suspended driver's licenses for unpaid fines and fees. We had fees for a lot of things that never should have fees, not that anything should have fees, but public defender fees, a probation fee, fees for GPS monitoring, fees for a jury trial that were more expensive than fees for a non-jury trial. That one still exists. When our campaign started working, one of the things we found is that, you know, for an average misdemeanor, someone is generally being charged over $500. And that if you then miss payments on that, there's no right to a payment plan, although that's what was happening generally in practice. People were getting KPSs, so bench warrants, getting arrested for that and getting additional fees every time they were arrested for that. So we kind of had the panoply of things not to do for fines and fees.
Yeah, wow, that's that is a huge cost. So Peggy, I wanted to turn now to you, because New York actually ranked near the top of the Fines and Fees Justice Index, but I think is a perfect example of why even the states that comparatively had more protective laws still have a pretty terrible state of play on fines and fees. So can you talk to us a little bit about what's going on in New York and why you're so committed to changing fines and fees policies there?
So, so I want to start by saying that, first of all, it has impacted me as a mother, and having a son that's been involved in the criminal, um, I don't want to say justice system, but the criminal system, and seeing how that has affected me with the, I mean, you don't really notice what they're doing until it's impacted you. And then when you finally realize that they've been doing this all along, that they continue to criminalize someone or keep someone in a system or in a cycle, then that's where you have to say, like, something has to change. Because then now you're raising revenue off of the backs of the poorest communities, the Black and Brown community, and you have no record and you don't even need the money. There's no record of where these fines and fees are going. And it costs more when you realize the cost of jailing someone because they can't pay something, because they can't pay this fine or this fee. You realize that you're spending more money just to get back what doesn't even exist. It's just such a small amount. And so I think as a mother, being impacted by it, I think that's been the hardest thing. And it's in everything, like the parole, the fees for parole, the supervision fees, and you have the traffic fees. And like every time you look around, there's one fee after another. When you think like, okay, I walked away, the judge let me walk out. Now you still have to fight the next battle, and the next battle. It's like you just never get out. It continues to go and go and go. And so you continue to be criminalized when you should have walked out, with some kind of hope, So it's just, yeah, it's very impacting, and it's something that needs to change. It definitely needs to change. And New York is one of the worst.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about New York, because it does things a little bit differently than some of the other states, in terms of many other states have sort of like lots and lots of fees that combine or that add up, but in New York there are these surcharges. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like in New York and how quickly people owe just huge amounts?
You look like
Sorry, you're on mute.
everything, because we criminalize the most. I think the laws that they put in place is never about the people. It's always how they can benefit from it. I always think of like, when you're not, it doesn't impact you until, it doesn't, you don't really want to see change until it impacts you. And I think because they're not being impacted, they continue to put these policies and these bills in place that benefit them, that takes from us. So it's like taking away my meal for you to have a bigger feast. And it's just like, it's unfair to our communities. And I think in every law and every bill and every policy that's put in place in New York is being put in place by people that will not be impacted by it. So it's easy to say, you pay $100 when you have so much more to live on. $100 is nothing to you. But for us, $100 makes a whole lot of difference when I'm on a budget and I have to pay rent and light or food. And so I have to give up one or the other, because if not, you're going to lock me up. And so now that's a bigger debt, because now you take me away from my children, because it's never about my son paying for it. Because if he doesn't have it, guess who has to pay for it? I do. Whether he's an adult, whether he's a young man, whatever it is, we're a family, and it still impacts us as a family. And I think that New York has the worst laws when it continues to criminalize and take away from the poorest communities, as opposed to making a change. And if the funds were even being used for us, but it continues to be poured into a system that continues to criminalize us. So it's not even being used to fund anything good for us or to make anything better for our communities. So I think, I think those who put these policies in place have to consider those that it's affecting and those that it's impacting, as opposed to just sitting there and just putting it in place because, all right, I just put it in place. It's never impacted you. You would never understand what I have to go through as a mother and the decisions I have to make for my family to function.
Thank you, Peggy. So Priya, I want to turn to you because we just heard about Delaware and we heard about New York. So you work nationally. Can you sort of put that in context? Does that fit what you are seeing in other states as well? How does that sort of compare to what you're seeing across the country?
Yeah, Lauren, I mean, I think what you said at the beginning really lifts up the issues, which is in every single state across the country, this is a problem. There is no good state. There is no even arguably better states than each other, even though sometimes we like to have to set up these comparisons to really understand. And partly because of what Peggy said, which is the harms that people are experiencing across the country, that families are experiencing, that individuals are experiencing, their communities are experiencing, that's universal, right? Everyone who is sort of somehow in touch with this system, and then these financial sanctions that get attached in this system is experiencing the same type of collateral consequences and punitive outcomes as a result of that contact. And so that is something that we see in every state. How it shows up, that's where the differences are, right? Whether it's showing up in public defender fees or juvenile fines and fees or these surcharges, right? The packaging of them is where the differences sort of occur across the country. But the fact that they exist is universal. And even the places that, on paper, when we look at them, can say oh, this policy seems like it's a little bit better than another state, or it doesn't seem as harmful, or, check some boxes for us. The practice, what is happening in the state, right? Even when judges have the ability to waive, are they actually waiving, or do they see the humanity in people when they're coming into their courtrooms? Or are they just, saying I've been a judge for so long, I've seen this time and time again, I'm just going to assess you with everything at this point, right? So even when we see discretion and an ability, we aren't seeing uniformity in approach. We're not seeing consistency across courts. We're not seeing the utilization of any of that discretion in a way that actually serves the communities that government is supposed to serve, right? Government is a service to the people. That is the point of government. And so who is government really serving? I think these questions that Peggy is asking is really vital to this work. Is what is the point of these systems, and what is the point of these fees in particular, right? And our conclusion is that the fees are really about revenue. They're about funding our governments. They're about generating sort of money in any which way we can when we haven't done the work on better fiscal policy on the front end, and at the cost of whom, right? And this is largely coming from communities that can't carry this type of burden. You're asking really unrealistic things of communities and individuals that aren't set up to do this, and then punishing them when they do not meet the unrealistic sort of circumstances we placed upon them, and then just saying, okay, we're going to punish you until you can succumb into this sort of system. And that just doesn't work. It creates so much harm, and you start to create these communities and experiences in existence that are just cyclical. Nobody is ever able to get out of the punishment, of the mistake, of the things that have happened, because they're just, once it happens, they're just in it for the rest of their lives. And, maybe I'm a little ideological, but that is not really the point of this country. That is not the point of these systems. It has never been the ideals that we have sort of set out to explore as a country. And yet sort of here we are across the country in every single state and the District of Columbia.
Yeah, thank you for that, Priya. I think one of the projects that we are taking on next is to actually look at what those practices are across the country, because even the states that have decent policies on the books, when we talk to the practitioners, when we talk to individuals who are directly impacted there, what we see is that the impact on people is still awful, even if there are better policies on the books. So Miriam, I wanted to turn it back to you, because so you have the status quo in Delaware where you have high fines and fees, you have for everything, including public defenders and juvenile court fines and fees. And um, so when you're starting to think about reform, where do you even start? Who do you try to work with to build a coalition? How do you decide priorities? Where do you even start with a campaign like that?
Well, our campaign, it kind of had a mixed history. So there was a bill before HB 244 that was introduced by a nonprofit in Delaware, the Delaware Center for Justice. And there was an attorney there that had done the drafting for it. And it was something that there hadn't been too much outreach before it was introduced. And it was going to do several things that HB 244 ended up doing, but also wasn't going to do some things that HB 244 ended up doing. So it was going to do ability to pay, have an ability to pay analysis at the time of sentencing, and it was going to get rid of driver's license suspensions. Those were the two major things. But it didn't get anywhere. It never made it out of its initial committee. And there was a pretty significant backlash from the courts who had not been a part of the negotiation and discussion before it was introduced, and also from law enforcement communities that get fees directly through the system. So our campaign started when that bill was introduced. There was our campaign is housed with Network Delaware, which is another nonprofit that's really just about helping people organize. And we used to meet at a church in downtown Wilmington every other week. And a part of the campaign, I think originally I was maybe the only lawyer. It was a lot of people that were it still is a lot of people that are directly impacted by fines and fees, folks in the community that just cared about this. So originally the campaign was about that bill, about fines and fees policies generally, about the decriminalization of poverty, but also with a focus on getting that bill passed. When the bill didn't make it, we then took kind of a more active role in wanting to put forward something that could go forward. So HB 244 was drafted truly in collaboration with the Attorney General's office, Attorney General Kathy Jennings, the Public Defender's office, Kevin O'Connell, and also with the courts, the Chief Court Administrator, Gail Lafferty. And our mission, what we did in terms of like our campaign and wanting to prioritize what would go in and what we could do is we wanted to get everything we could, is really how we saw it. There's a lot more work still to do in Delaware. Obviously, like the rankings we improved, and that's great, but even outside the rankings, anything Priya and Peggy both touched on this, there's so much that's happening that happens that you can't see just by looking on the books. And there's so much that's really unfair about the process. Even the #1 state still has so much work to do because it's really a cruel process and just a cruel system that we're doing to people. So our goal was to get as much as we could. That ended up being getting rid of fines and fees for children, getting rid of driver's license suspensions for unpaid fines and fees, getting rid of the public defender fee, probation fees, a couple more minor fees. So there was a surcharge for every time you made a payment. If you went in person to make a payment during limited hours, you wouldn't get a surcharge. But if you paid online or through the phone or through kiosks that were open 24/7, you got a surcharge every time you made those payments, which for most people who have money to make a payment and therefore are working, you just always had to pay the surcharge. So it got rid of the surcharge, and then it also created a study group to push for further reform. So, there were other parts that we had wanted. We wanted payment plan. We'd wanted a right to a payment plan and having it spelled out exactly how payment plans work. Right now, it's a totally ad hoc process in Delaware. Every court, every judge, every day is different in terms of what people are facing in payment plans, which means there's no predictability. And it also means that everyone's just kind of at the whim of the judicial officer that they appear in front of, if they even appear in front of a judicial officer. Most courts, the way they're functioning right now, if you get a capias for failure to pay, or even before that, if you get a warning and you have to come in for a hearing, then you usually don't even see a judicial officer. You will see court staff who set up the payment plan. And as long as the payment plan is set up and you arrive, you never actually see the judge. So all of that is really ad hoc and unfair. So we wanted a payment plan. We also wanted some extensions for, Delaware does have a process by which certain fees and fines can be paid off by doing volunteer hours, but it sounds better than it actually is. It's run by corrections, which is fraught, obviously, getting people further involved where they might not have been on probation, might not have had any interaction with the Department of Corrections, and then they have to because of money. And usually the community service was something that required like physical exertion, which just isn't possible for everyone. And it usually also was during traditional work hours. So anyone that had any kind of mobility issues or just couldn't be somewhere between 9 and 5 because they already had obligations, couldn't do those, still can't do those service hours. And it's also compensated at the federal minimum wage. And, you know, like when I was a public defender, my advice to clients was always literally any job will pay you better than those volunteer hours because you have to put money, you have to put time in the front end to get it set up. Then you don't have any options for when you're doing it. You can actually get in trouble for not fulfilling it, like extra trouble for not fulfilling it once you started the process. And it's not going to compensate you as much as literally any job would. Not that it's so easy to get a job or do any of those things, or that that's possible for anyone. But so that was another thing that we wanted, is extending that so that it was more reasonable, so that it included more options. So for instance, if someone was you know, struggling with a substance abuse disorder, they could go to treatment for their substance abuse disorder, and that would count towards paying off fines and fees. Again, some of these things are kind of band-aids, but what we had done is we had a couple of sessions where we really sat down with our whole campaign, listed, you know, what's our wish list, what's like everything we want to get, and then had gone through and said, what can we reasonably get, and what are our priorities. Some of the things that were our priorities were things we didn't end up being able to get, but some of them were. I'll tell you one of the reasons that some of the fees we were able to eliminate were because those were items that didn't have as much backlash. So the public defender fee was $100 for every case, but the money actually went to the general fund for the state. So it didn't go directly to public defense. So it didn't have, I mean, the public defender's office is on board, was and is on board for getting rid of fees in general, but there wasn't a direct like recipient of the money that would have any kind of, that would put up a fuss. It was just from the general fund. And that was $100. So that's one of the more significant fees. Probation and parole fee was another one that we targeted because it's significant. It was $200. And so we kind of took and chose based on what we could get done and we could get consensus on, but also what would have the biggest impact. You know, our goal as a campaign is to get rid of all fees for everyone, and also to have fines appropriate for someone's actual income. So if you're making a lot of money, you should pay more, and if you don't have any money, you shouldn't pay anything. And then, you know, and then obviously that's only in the context of adults. Children shouldn't pay anything ever. But so that was kind of, that was a lot of words, but that was how we came forward with the legislation, is we wanted everything we could get. And everything that was put in there were things that the courts and the Attorney General's office worked with. So before it was introduced, we kind of already done a lot of the narrowing, with the understanding that if either of those groups was opposed to something, we wouldn't really be able to move it through the legislature.
That's incredibly helpful to talk through. I think the narrowing process and what's next, what's still left on the table, the work that's left to be done. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that HB 244 is just hugely impactful. And what did get passed, I think, actually, because it eliminates juvenile court fines and fees and suspension of driver's licenses, has a direct impact on so many people's lives in Delaware. And so, you know, congratulations for getting that passed. And also, and also for recognizing that there's a lot more work to be done. So Peggy, I want to turn to you, because there is a bill in New York that has not yet passed, but that is building some momentum, the End Predatory Court Fees Act. And so that would make New York the first to end all criminal court fees if it passes. So I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about also who are you working with on this? What is, what are the groups that are coming together to try to get this passed? And what would the End Predatory Court Fees Act do? How would that impact families if it does pass?
Okay, so first I want to say that I'm working with the No Price on Justice with Center for Community Alternatives, and what that would do, it would eliminate the mandatory court surcharges, and eliminate the parole and probation fees, and eliminate the mandatory minimum fines, so that judges can set fines based on people's ability to pay. But I want to say something about that. So you say discretion. When we say discretion, then every judge is different. And so there are judges that are going to pick and choose who they want to use discretion for. So I really have a problem with that, when there can be something put and set in place that has to be consistent all across the board, where a judge can't say, well, I don't feel like doing it for you today, because we know that that's reality and that happens. A judge can look at somebody's record and say, you know what, I'm not giving this person a shot. You know what I mean? And I think that's unfair. It's a racist system. It's an unjust system. And I think there needs to be something more consistent across the board. Something that someone else said about the punishing, it's a consistent punishment all across the board. You're punishing people for being poor. You're punishing people for making a mistake. And you're telling them, you're never going to come out of this. You made this mistake, it's forever. And I think, and another thing that stuck out to me is when you say that the funds are going to a service that we're supposed to be getting for free for counsel. It's supposed to be a free service. So if it's supposed to fund that service, so then it's not really a free service. We're funding something and you're getting it from the poorest peoples that you're supposed to be helping. So, and then to find out it goes to a general fund. So it doesn't even go to where it's supposed to go. And I think the No Price on Justice is something very, very important, and especially jailing people, continue to incarcerate people because they can't pay these fines and fees. It costs, so much more money to incarcerate someone. You look at somebody who's homeless, who has nothing, and you lock them up and you expect them to pay a fee to get out, a bail to get out. It's always something to get out. Like you're taking something from somebody who has nothing, and so I think that this bill would really help New Yorkers to get past their mistakes, to get past. I think there should be more opportunity for people to work, for people to move on with their lives, to people to get a second chance and stop having to continually be criminalized or be in jail on paper. It's like being in jail, it still holds you just because you owe. So I fully support this No Price on Justice and the End Predatory Court Fees Act. And I think that it needs to pass this year. Like this is a very, very, very important bill that has to pass.
Yeah, I think you touched on a number of things. I think people are, when I talk about fines and fees with folks who don't work in this field, I think people are most surprised to hear about the public defender fees, because people assume that when you say, if you can't afford a lawyer, one will be appointed for you. People assume that means you're going to get a lawyer for free. But in all but 8 states, that's not the case. There are fees that are tacked on for it that follow people for years or even for life. And I heard someone talking the other day, and there was this turn of phrase that I want to borrow because it just resonated, which is that a criminal record shouldn't be a life sentence to poverty. And that's what fines are so many people. So Priya, I want to turn to you to talk about this campaign that you have launched this fall to end all criminal court fees across the country. So I want to ask, how did you determine that as a goal? How did you set that as a goal? Who are you working with, and what are sort of the next steps that you're envisioning as you embark on this campaign?
Yeah, so we launched the End Justice Fees campaign in October of this year. in partnership and sort of main partnership with the ACLU and Americans for Prosperity. One of the main reasons that we focused in on this goal of eliminating fees in the criminal justice system, and we also sort of attached traffic to that, but less words for a campaign, but we mean them both. And the reason that we focused on this is, one, we're really at a point in time where we really need to separate these two issues, fines from fees, right? They are in fact two different things. They serve two different purposes. And at least in the adult space, there is likely going to be a place for a fine in the adult system as alternatives to something much more severe, right? We do not want people being incarcerated for things that we can find alternative ways of dealing with that. And the fine itself is the punishment, right? So let's have a conversation around, we make mistakes, what do we do? What does accountability look like? How do we get people to sort of restore themselves and others and move out of this system and into a, hopefully better, healthy decision-making life, right? And that is different than fees. Fees are about revenue. They're about generating money to fund either, the criminal justice system or not the criminal justice system and just government operations. And that is the responsibility. Our government is the responsibility of us all, right? And if there are essential parts of the government, then all of us are paying for the essential parts of the government, right? The criminal legal system isn't there for the people who are getting sort of captured into the system. It's there for society as a whole, right? Like regardless of who's involved with it, the point of its existence is, there are victims or other sort of reasons why the system exists. It exists for us all. It exists for the value of society. And that means all of us have a responsibility in its existence and what that should look like, whether it should be as big as it is. All of these are the right types of questions that we should be asking, including how we fund it, right? And this is no different than our education system and sort of other systems that we have determined are essential to our core. And this is one of those systems. And so it's been really important to separate the issues and start really building the narrative around eliminating fees, right? Having policymakers, folks who are working in the advocacy space really understanding that these are two different things and that the only goal for fees is that they shouldn't exist. We shouldn't be rolling them into having them go into the general revenue instead of, go here, because ultimately where they go is less relevant in the fact that they exist and that this is a mechanism for funding government. And so that's why we focused in on this, because we know the conversations and narrative around accountability, what is an appropriate fine, how do you impose the appropriate fine, and having real parameters. And as Peggy sort of said, not discretion in a way that you're getting completely different outcomes from completely different judges for the same type of things, because they looked at your nails and your phone and determined like you can do something that that's not how we sort of should be arbitrating justice around this country. So now focusing on the fees. And honestly, what we've also found is that fees actually make the bulk of this entire thing up. It's not the fines, right? That fines are oftentimes not being imposed, that they're being waived, that they're not really the major. I mean, there are some areas like the mandatory ones that Peggy sort of lifted up where we do need to tackle that for a different, in a different way, because they're mandatory and they don't even sort of like give any, and they're large when they're mandatory. But most of the time what we're seeing is that it's the fees that are imposed. Even when you come in for like a traffic violation, they may say, all right, we'll get rid of all of this, pay your court costs and fees, go to the clerk, go do this. They're really more concerned about you paying for the cost of like the whole operation. And I think we need to shed light on that. We need to have more Americans understand that this is actually how the system works. We need more policymakers to understand this is actually how the system works. And then we need to sort of be moving towards eliminating that. And the last piece I'll say is on the partnership side, the reason that we launched this campaign in partnerships with these two organizations and the very extensive coalition of, nearly 70 members at this time across the country is because we do want to show that regardless of what value propositions you're coming to this work from. I'm coming because I'm an impacted person and I know exactly how this, this work is, this policies are playing out. I'm coming to this because I believe in second chances and the ability for people to re-enter and have a really fair shot at having a different life on the other side, or civil rights, or honestly, overreach of government and regressive taxation, right? Whatever your sort of values are, this issue hits all of them because it's cutting against really everything most advocacy groups and organizations that are working in criminal justice believe in, and it is not advancing any of their goals, and is in fact sort of serves only one purpose. And I think we want to lift that partnership up and show that at a time when most people don't agree on like what day of the week it is, even, that we agree on this, and we are all working in coalition to end it. And so you're not going to go to a partner and they're going to say, actually, we should keep those fees. Like those fees are, you know, kind of good, and we don't want, no, like everyone, whether you're AFP or ACLU, saying the same thing. They're harmful. They shouldn't be here. You need to get rid of them. And that's the only solution.
Yeah, I think that's great. And it gets sort of into the next question that I was going to pose about strategy, but you know, it makes me think also, Priya, that it's no coincidence that the history of fees tracks really closely with the history of mass incarceration in this country. That as we started to see the tough on crime policies of the 80s and 90s, we started to see this huge explosion in the number of people who were incarcerated. Then we also see fees starting to increase, and using that to really fund our system of mass incarceration, to fund our court system and law enforcement and prisons and jails. And so that's no coincidence. But so I wanted to jumping off where you were, Priya, to turn it over to you, Miriam, about what are the lessons that you've learned in terms of messaging and in terms of strategy? What works to convince legislators, particularly across the aisle, thinking about, you know, working not only with Democrats, but with Republicans, but what have you found works in terms of moving the campaign forward in Delaware?
I think what we found works is really a lot of the same stuff Priya was saying. It's truly an issue that like everyone, I think, when explained to them, like you have to get behind it. Most of the time, the way that we phrase things, honestly, I think that you kind of only have two choices: support it or admit to being evil, kind of thing. You know, like there are no good arguments for any of this system. Delaware, the legislation we passed, Delaware right now has a super majority with the Democratic Party, but there was bipartisan support for our bill. Truly, it's that it makes no sense like any way you cut it. Anyone that is working on campaigns in jurisdictions, one thing that we found to be probably one of the most persuasive things that we cited, like every presentation we ever did, we cited this, is the Brennan Center did a study about the efficiency of collecting fines and fees. And they found that it is over 100 times more efficient to collect government revenue through general taxation through the IRS or state equivalent than it is through court fines and fees. They studied 3 different states and several different counties. One of the counties, this is my favorite, one of the counties that they studied was spending $1.17 for every dollar that they collected. So they were actually losing money by trying to collect fines and fees. I think it doesn't matter someone's politics. If you're talking to someone and you mention that it just, even just strictly as a revenue source, despite the fact that, I mean, it's obviously a really cruel system. But even if you set aside the cruelty aspect, it's an inefficient system. And even, even if someone isn't going to be persuaded, which I hope everyone would, but even if someone isn't going to be persuaded by arguments around justice and fairness, those people can still be persuaded around arguments about what's efficient. It just doesn't make any sense. And really that's what we found to be the most, the most effective, is covering all the bases for why the system doesn't make any sense. We had, again, anyone that's working on this right now, I really encourage you to just have like a lot of meetings and do a lot of presentations. We have like a PowerPoint deck that we have modified like 20 different times to just make slight tweaks that just goes over the system in Delaware, goes over like that Brennan Center study and some other stats that we found like most persuasive. And it's just 5 minutes. It's literally like 5 minutes. And the more rooms we could get into where we just gave that 5-minute presentation, the more support we had for this. When the bill was introduced, our biggest hurdle was really just the fiscal note. Again, Delaware being a super but it had a sizable fiscal note, and it's always one of those like, well, I support it, but like we can't really fund it kind of issues. And so that was our major hurdle, is getting the funding for it. And when it was going before fiscal committees in the Delaware legislature, we had a letter of support that we put together that had churches on it. It had the AG's office and the courts. It had lawyer groups. It had, I mean, we had support from the Delaware State Bar Association. Like, it was groups that are conservative and liberal. There's a alliance in Wilmington of businesses, and my co-coordinator, who I should mention, Lynn Keelhorn, who is an amazing person. She had done presentations with Wilmington Alliance and got them on board to support the legislation. I think one thing I really encourage people is, don't think that this is an issue that is left wing or right wing or anything. It's an everyone issue. Truly, everyone, when explained this process, when they understand the system we're talking about, I think will support it, should support it. And if they don't, I don't know. I haven't come across anyone yet, but I think when folks fully understand it, they support it.
Yeah, that's great. And I think you're so right that people, even who might not otherwise be inclined to care about this issue or to focus on it, when you look at the fiscal impact and realize that it's just a very inefficient way to even try to raise money, that it doesn't actually bring the money that people think it does, like, that is also persuasive to people who might not otherwise care about this issue. I wanted to encourage people that the Q&A is open. If anybody has questions, please put them in there as we're getting to the end of the hour. But Peggy, I wanted to turn a similar question to you, which is, what are the strategies that you're using in New York to, New York is in this interesting political moment right now with some of the backlash on criminal justice reform after bail reform. But are there strategies that you're finding are persuasive to bring people on board with ending the Predatory Court Fees Act?
Well, I want to first and foremost, the most important thing is educating. And on a day-to-day, just talking to people and just making them aware. I think a lot of people are not aware, because I've gone to Albany with CCA and talked to the people there, and they're like, oh, I didn't even know that. Like, they're not even aware, And so once you make people aware, but I think as a mother, who's been impacted by this, and I think this year sharing this story is even more impactful. Losing my son this summer to gun violence. Dante Wright, a 20-year-old Black man, was stopped by police, a traffic stop. And after pulling him over, they realized he had $346 in fines and fees, and went to arrest him. And by the end of the ordeal, he was murdered. He was shot dead. Like, how? And as a mother who had my son suffered and struggled with mental health issues, the thought of that, to be stopped, to be scared every time police stop you, and he got a death sentence over $346, And so I, as a mother in New York, afraid of what could happen to my son. So after he had some court issues and they gave him, he had to pay some fees and fines for every charge. And of course, he doesn't have to pay that. I have to pay that. But of course, him seeing mom, as a widow, having to just care for us. And now mom has to come out of her pocket to pay for this. And so that summer in 2019, he was let out, and they told him he had to pay these fines and fees. He searched and searched and searched for work. And, we also know that's hard, because there's a lot of racism in that. And there's just so many other things that go with that. They don't give second chances, and, we need a clean slate and all of these things. And so he looked for work and couldn't find work. And when he finally got a job, it was way out in Long Island. It was Amazon hired him. He was so excited, but then he was like, how am I going to get there? And he had a breakdown at home. And so I called for help. I called for EMT. I said, please do not send the police, send EMT. He's having a breakdown. He needs some help. And not even like 2 minutes. It was like a drug bust. I had so many cops outside my home, and he was afraid. He locked himself in his room. He locked us out. I was outside with them, so he locked the door. So I stood by the door, and they wanted to break my door. They kept insisting that they were going to break my door, and I was like, but he's fine. He's not aggressive. He's nothing. He just needs, he needs an EMT. I'm not going to let you in until EMS comes. But they insisted, and he spoke to them through the window. He told them he was fine. The officer asked him, he's like, I know you, Justin. Like, tell me what happened. And he talked to them very nicely. He said, I'm fine. He showed them his body. And EMT came, and they still insisted, and the sergeant insisted, and they were very aggressive, and none of us were aggressive. And a truck pulled up with all these tools and shields, and they came running out. They never once asked me to move. They took me right down. He heard me screaming to leave my son alone, not to break my door. He heard me screaming. He opened the door. He said, that's my mom. They grabbed him by the neck. They pulled him down. They beat him up. And I spent the night in jail, and my son never got the help he needed. So that was a scary moment for me, because you look at a system that it's just a scary time to live in. So as for Dante Wright, that hits home for me. We should not have to live like this over fines and fees. He had a breakdown because he was afraid if he didn't pay this money, he was going to go back to jail. Then he gets a job, and he can't get to the job because it's so far. He doesn't have a car. And so then all of this happens. I end up in jail. He ends up in the hospital. 2 minutes later, he comes out, and he never gets the help he needs. Nothing gets resolved. Thank God my son was alive at that time to tell, that we were able to help him. But just hearing stories like this. So I think educating all those that you come into contact with, every opportunity that you get to educate people on the dangers of trying to collect these fines and fees, on the harms it does to our community, that it continues to criminalize our communities. And looking at it, it's policies for profit. Like, you're putting these policies in place just to make profit, when you can actually help people. So I think the most important thing for me is educating and going to all those in leadership, and all those that are able to help make those changes, and talking to them and educating them. I think it's going to make a big, big difference, I think, as we continue to work together to do this and to educate people on it.
Yeah, thank you for that, Peggy. I mean, I don't know how anybody can listen to your story and listen to that passion and the passion of a mom in particular, and not be moved by that, and really want to change the system. So we, Priya, I want to also give you an opportunity to talk about how people can get involved in your campaign to end court fees. But we also had a question come in that I think is probably best suited to you, which is, in many states, one use of fines and fees is in part to fund the crime victim compensation program, which pays out financial compensation for costs incurred as a result of being a victim of crime. Has this been an issue or factor in your work? And have you had any successes in coalition building to secure alternate sources of funding for survivor support? So I wanted to pose both of those things to you as we're sort of heading towards wrapping up.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I want to say a couple things on that question. One, there are a lot of good things that the fines and fees that we have in the system are going towards, right? So there's like we really try to be careful around this conversation that we're oftentimes not talking about the initiative, the program, the place the money goes, although sometimes lots of questionable things. So you really have to sort of look at that. But these things like victims compensation funds are definitely ones that come up across the country. We just released a 50-state survey on assessment and surcharges and fees that you can take a look at, which highlights some of these. We are not advocating for those compensation funds to have less money. Those should be funded. They should be funded properly. They should be funded by a steady state of revenue that is reliable, which, as Miriam has already pointed out, comes from a different source, right? Through different policies, and shouldn't be relied on by someone needs to commit an offense, then they need to be charged fees, and then that person or their family will have to pay those fees in order for that fund to be whole and to have money. That fund needs to be whole and have money, and it shouldn't be tied to people committing crimes, right? And so that is just we need to disentangle these things, right? And so we are oftentimes when that particular fee is on the table in a state, when that is the one that, or it's a part of a package, the whole plan is around, well, how are we going to generate and stabilize the revenue that is going towards wherever the money may be going, including victim compensation funds. And that network building, that coalition building is also why folks are able to establish partnerships, because we are also finding that the recipients, they're not wed to the fee. Like they're not like, yes, you should charge this and this is what you should do. What they're wed to is protecting the services or sort of functions that they are providing. And so how do we come up with proper, stable budget solutions for whatever those may be, including, you know, victim compensation fund. And I think the victim compensation and victims in general is a really interesting area, because oftentimes the person who is in the system is also the victim of a crime, right? And so we're not, in fact, talking about two different people a lot of times, or two different families, or two different communities. We're talking about one and the same. And so we really, you know, there isn't, you know, that is a very nuanced, really, you know, thoughtful sort of space that we need to be in. Who are we talking about? What are we talking about? And in a lot of these policies, it's the same communities that are paying the cost of the poor policy, literally the cost, but also are at the sort of forefront of like the system failures themselves, whatever the root causes of those may be as well. So that's how we're doing this work. That's how we're talking about it. And, you know, we really are asking more and more groups to join Injustice Fees. You can go to the website, I think David's put into the chat, and sign up to be a part of the coalition. And that's how we're sharing information. You can go and get resources. And we're working with advocates like Miriam and Peggy across the country to, you know, put these strategies in place, provide whatever support we can, and hopefully see more and more laws changing and folks ending their use of fees in the system until there aren't any left.
Fantastic. Towards a debt-free 2023, let's see how much progress we can make in this upcoming year. As we are heading towards the top of the hour, thank you to our panelists, to Miriam, to Peggy, to Priya. It was just been fantastic having you talk today. I wanted to also say, please reach out to Priya if you're interested in joining the campaign. If we at the National Center for Access to Justice can be helpful, we hope that these reports that we've just created will be helpful for people who are starting and want to diagnose the problem in their state, want to look at the beginnings of a roadmap for reform, and find some of the citations, even some of the nitty gritty. We hope that those will be helpful, but please reach out to Priya, reach out to me. I put my my email into the chat. We also got a question about recording of this. We have been recording this. We will, if people want to email me, I'm happy to send it directly, but we'll also post it on our website so that people can access it. So thank you all for joining us. Happy holidays. And we are hoping for lots and lots of success and reforms of fines and fees in the coming year. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
I thank you.